Let us pray. God, may the meditation of our hearts and the words of our words in this your world. In Christ's name, we pray. Amen. This morning, somebody noted that I have changed, and I guess that's a good thing, I think. Since I started working here in 1995, that was a little while ago. One would assume that I have changed, and I'm going to take that as a compliment, despite the fact that I had hair at the time. And I was reminded of this fact just last Sunday, actually. I was in Montreal, and I was at an event, and there were pictures there, and there was a picture of me driving on my way home from my interview to get the job here at Westminster. I was a university student at the time at Queen's, and my friend Pete and my friend Mark had decided that they would come to Ottawa with me for this interview, which is a good thing because they had to kind of borrow/steal Pete's dad's car to get here. And it was a nice car, kind of an Acura Legend, but it was fast. We got here, this is the day before Google, we didn't know the neighborhood at all. And so I dropped off Mark and Pete at Whispers down on Richmond. And then I drove over, had my interview. You know, Mark is Jewish, Pete was an atheist, and here's this Christian guy interviewing for a youth director job. By the time I got back to Whispers, I was now the designated driver to get us back home. And the picture was a picture of me that Pete had taken from the passenger side, driving his dad's Acura Legend. I'm not sure why he wanted evidence of this event, but there it was with my flowing locks. I was at this event because my friend Pete died, and it was a memorial of sorts. Pete, as I said, was an atheist, but he was also a psychologist. And he had done his graduate work while I was here in Ottawa. He had done it in Montreal. And his widow and his two children had organized an event at McGill with his old classmates. And we had come together at a wine and cheese, because psychologists apparently do wine and cheeses. And we were there, some of them hadn't seen each other for almost 20 years. And his children were there, and partly he had organized this event in order to allow his children to meet some of his friends from a different time in his life. Because the last 5 years or so, Pete's life were not the best. They were difficult, in fact. And so his children, who are 18 and 16, we wanted them to have memories, or at least to know their dad in a different way than they might have otherwise done. If all they could remember was the last number of years, years back there were golden years. And so a chance to be able to share that with his kids. And it was also a time for people to think about their own life and their own, what they're doing in their own lives. It's not uncommon for people to die, obviously, but it wasn't expected. And so these 50-year-olds or 40-year-olds or those kind of ages were questioning their own sort of what am I doing with my life? There was a moment for that as well. And it was also a moment to launch an award that this group of people had funded in my friend Pete's name to give to future psychologists who are training at McGill. And so they all contributed to a fund, a scholarship of sorts to give out. So the Dr. Peter Hogan Award can now be given out every year. Now, all of this seems perhaps a little bit strange to start, but today we are in some ways supposed to remind ourselves about All Saints. This is the day before Halloween, the day when all kind of chaos goes on, and we are supposed to remind ourselves that we are just a little bit closer, perhaps, to death than we might want. And so this event last weekend really put me into that space to think about that. There are three sort of fundamental questions, or three fundamental aspects of that I want us to think about a little bit. The first is, how do we remember the saints, those who have gone before? How do we remember them? Do we remember them when they had hair? Do we remember them now? That's a silly example, obviously. But do we remember Pete in his last years, or do we remember Pete in his golden years? Which one is the real Pete? Which one is his essence as a person? Secondly, what happens to Pete now? After the event, somebody posted on Facebook, a psychologist who has no faith, really, saying, "This was a great event, thank you for organizing it. I'm sure that Pete was up there looking down and happy that we were drinking wine and cheese." And I'm sure that he was happy that we were drinking wine and cheese, but where does this person get this sense that somehow Pete is still existing and is looking down, as if there's a physical location that, like, we're already on the 15th floor? Are they, like, is he higher than that? Where does this idea come from? And how does it just become something that we can do and put out there on Facebook in this common sort of way? So what happens to somebody when they die? And then the third question is, how do we go on to live with that? In Pete's case, there's an award that his name will live on, hopefully in perpetuity, but for a long time. But how would our legacy move forward? How does it continue into the future? These questions became, obviously, are difficult questions. They're emotional questions. But they're questions that have become very real to me, not just because of my friend Pete, but because of my work in Malawi. In Africa, there's a much more explicit sense that the ancestors live with us. And this was actually a huge point of conflict between the missionaries and the Africans that they encountered in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was a huge point of conflict where missionaries would come and say, "You are ancestor worshipers, and you need to stop that." And so there was, in some ways, a theological reason why the missionaries were saying this to the Malawians, in this case. They thought that the Malawians revered their ancestors as sort of godlike people. And we are to have no God except for God, and therefore any of this needs to end, and it needs to stop. It's superstition, and it's dangerous. And even to this day, my students, when we talk about this, this is a very live and real conversation for them. What does it mean to have ancestors? What does it mean to live well into the future? And how do the people that we know and love, what happens to them? This is very real for them. I'd argue that it's actually quite real for us as well. We just do a little bit different job at hiding it. If you look around in this room, right? This window, Hurry Field, right? If we look around, the ancestors are here. Their names are listed in these different places. Their names are written in books. The legacy in which there's a hall down there. Go ahead and look at these pictures, right? This is our ancestors being present for us. How many people have pictures of their loved ones up in their home? Not just the ones who are here, but those who have also passed. Why would we do that? Except we think that somehow it's important to keep the memory of this ancestor alive. What's happened? And how do we continue that legacy? These are questions that we do face. Maybe we just don't do it head on. I think we don't do it head on, in part because we're a much more individualistic society. In Malawi, people think in terms of who they are, in terms of their family or their place. And so when I mentioned this morning about the greeting, it's very important for them to know that I come from this place and I'm only being in this place temporarily. So this morning, Alan told me that he stayed in the same apartment for 45 years, right? And so in North America, we would like to say that he lives there. But for them, for a Malawian, they wouldn't say that he lives there. He stays there. Because his village is over an ocean, some other place. That's where he's from. And it's important to differentiate between those two things. I stay here, but I live there. Even though he hasn't been there for 45 years. But you've been there, obviously, but you haven't lived there for 45 years. So they think in terms of a community, a village, a people that they belong to. And so the ancestors are part of that network, which is much more important to them than it might be to a society that is very individualistic. There's also a criticism to be made, or a critique that to be made, that in general, Malawians would be less secular than we might be, than those who live in North America. And by secular, I don't necessarily mean those who come and go to church, but those who actually believe that there is a world that is a spiritual world that is beyond our sense perception. That there is a God and there are spirits that are out there that interact and can interact in our human everyday activities. We get some sense of this, maybe, when we talk about a guardian angel. What is a guardian angel except for a spiritual being that can somehow interfere in the ongoing work of the world? So if you believe in guardian angels, you are just a little bit not secular, which is perhaps good in this case. But a Malawian death certificate can indicate that some kind of spiritual curse or some kind of spiritual being was involved in the death of that person. And so there may be a physical reason, but there could also be a spiritual reason. These two things are not mutually exclusive, And they actually almost always occur together in tandem. A blessing is somehow something that God is doing, and is active, and something that is bad, sickness or health or illness, is a curse or something that's negative. These two things, this individual secularism versus communitarian enchantedness, or this ability to see the world as spiritual and physical, are quite different in the way that they approach things. And it means that they approach death in a much different way. They actually likely approach death in a way that's closer to the passage that we have in Hebrews than we are. This passage in Hebrews this morning is a part of a long list of the sort of Hall of Fame of faith. We could have kept on going. It struck me again this morning as it was read that the very first Hall of Fame is that God created the world by faith, out of nothing, so that there could be no argument that God took some other material that some other God made and then reshaped it. That's not, because that means that God is less powerful than the God who can create out of nothing. But then there's this mantra of by faith Abraham does this, by faith Sarah does this, by faith Enoch. Hello, you have to go back and look at your account in Genesis to figure out Enoch. But Enoch, by faith. By faith, by faith, by faith. And so it's understandable that we would call it the Hall of Fame of faith. And there is some sense in which we can feel good that, it's a chronological line. We're supposed to fit into this line. But the problem that Africans faced when the missionaries came and told them that they were to stop their ancestor understanding their way that they understood ancestors is that it's very difficult for you to have an ancestor that's not from your place. Your ancestors are your people, and my ancestors are my people. And these two things don't mix. You could marry into that, but I can't count your ancestors as my ancestors. Does that make sense? So then the problem becomes, how is Jesus available to become each of our ancestors? How can we be found in Jesus? How can we have Enoch and Noah and Abraham and eventually Jesus as our ancestors unless we're born into those people? This was the problem that the Africans told the missionaries. They're like, you keep telling us about this Jesus, but he's your ancestor, not our ancestor. Ghanaian theologian Kwame Bediego, who writing in the 80s and the 90s, recognized this and says Hebrews is the answer to that. Because there is nobody who is naturally in the family of Jesus as as our ancestor, unless you're Jewish. And so all of us have to somehow become part of that line. We have to somehow get in there. And Hebrews is the answer to that. Hebrews is telling us that Jesus is our high priest. We didn't read that section, but Hebrews will talk about the fact that the priests in that plan and that with those ancestors, they needed to continue to do it for their own people. But Jesus, he does it once and for all people. And so in that, he's offered a sacrifice that is sufficient for everybody. And we are part of that then. He's able to engraft people through his sacrifice that he has made, through his death, and then through his resurrection. He becomes our ancestor by dying for us, as us. And then he becomes our Savior by being raised as our ancestor for us and with us. This is the argument that Hebrews is making. It's all about ancestors. It's all about how do I get Jesus to be my ancestor. And the Africans were like, you silly white people, don't you see? This is the good news. That your Jesus, if you would just read your Bible, your Jesus can't be our Jesus. But you have to stop denying that you have ancestors. Otherwise, Jesus isn't going to be your Jesus either. Our students always get clap at that one. You don't have to clap. They're like, yes, we are right. So Jesus is our ancestor. And in that, we can come back to our three questions. How do we remember? Well, we need to remember Jesus as the one who came, created, who was in flesh, who died, but then who was raised. And so each time we rehearse that, each time we go back and remember that, we are in some ways remembering our own history, our own people. That's why we do communion on a regular basis, so that we can have in our hands, this is our ancestor who is broken for us, so that we might have hope. Jesus, certainly in Hebrews, and I think in general, Hebrews is very clear that Jesus sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty and is there to intercede on our behalf. This was always one of the roles that the ancestors played in African or Malawian understandings, that they are intercessors, meaning they're not powerful necessarily in of themselves, but they are able to bring communications to God. And if you have any Roman Catholic background, this might sound familiar to what Roman Catholics would talk about in terms of saints or Mary. Mary herself doesn't have power technically, but she is able to intercede on our behalf. But we can talk about whether or not that's true or whether or not that's to what extent that's true. But it's much different than saying I worship Mary than to say that Mary is an intercessor, somebody who is petitioning on my behalf. That was the African understanding of what ancestors were. And so they completely understood when they said in Hebrews, Jesus is our intercessor. They said, yes, of course, because he's our ancestor. That's what ancestors do. They intercede. But he's more powerful than any other ancestor because he can have anybody as in his clan. So he's above all of the others. So Jesus, where is this? Our ancestors are in some ways above and beyond. But Jesus is above that. And we participate in that in faith. And so then what does that mean in terms of our memory or living that out? How do we move forward with that? Well, of course, I think things like stained glass windows in the church are a good way in some ways to remember, right? Because it is to say these are our ancestors in faith, and so we can do these things, and we can honor them. And we shouldn't shirk away from that, and we should also not sentimentalize it entirely. Because what it should also do is spur us on to be more faithful, to question what kind of legacy we are going to leave. How do we leave our plans, our families, our ancestors? Are we living into what Jesus has already done for us. It strikes me that one of the things that the missionary encounter with Africans can help us, and then subsequently by allowing students clapping when they realize that they're right. One thing that does strike me is that there is likely an analogy between the ways that settlers in North America have interacted with First Nations people. It's a communitarian society that has a strong drive in order to honor ancestors. That we might do well in our reconciliation to first come to grips with the fact that Jesus is our ancestor and their ancestor. And to be able to then hear what kind of beliefs and what kind of strengths come from that. What kind of understandings about life and virtue, death, where we go. It might open us up to be able to have a real conversation about memory and how we might move forward together as brothers and sisters. So Jesus is our faithful ancestor, the one who has died and risen so that we can be engrafted into God's family. Let's go forward. Tomorrow, when there's all that candy, all that Halloween, those children coming to your door, and all those things, to remember that Jesus continues to be your ancestor. And he is more powerful and stronger than any other force. He holds our ancestors, and then that encourages us to go forward and to live lives of goodness to each other.